Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to talk about relocating back to the United States, a fast-track option to get green cards for the family of U.S. citizens. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Adam Weiss. I'm an attorney here at Schear Immigration law firm. I'm a U.S. licensed attorney, been practicing for over 20 years. Schear Immigration law firm is a boutique corporate immigration and relocation firm located in Tel Aviv, Israel. I handle our U.S.-based, family-based practice. So today we're going to talk about a situation where a U.S. citizen wants to get a green card for their spouse and or their minor child. And they need to relocate back to the States. They live outside the U.S. with their family, and they need to find a way to get the green card and still be able to relocate within their preferred time frame. And that's where we're going to start. Now, oftentimes, we encounter a client who is a U.S. citizen living abroad with their family, working abroad, and they either are being transferred back to the U.S. by their current employer to the U.S. office, or they have a job offer in the U.S. And they're a U.S. citizen, they can go freely back to the U.S., but they want to obviously take their family with them. Often their spouse, sometimes their minor children are not U.S. citizens, and they need to get a green card for them to relocate and move with the family. And the problem is that the regular green card process just takes too long for most people in that situation. So we're going to talk about today a way to fast track it, to be able to get the green card in a much faster way than the regular process through the U.S. So to start, whenever we talk about getting a green card, the first place to start is to be sure that who's eligible. Now, you'll see the graphic here. A U.S. citizen can sponsor for a green card their spouse, their children, their siblings, and their parents. We're talking about, obviously, an adult U.S. citizen. A green card holder can also sponsor immediate family members for a green card. However, only certain relatives will be called immediate relatives, meaning they don't have to wait in line to be able to process a visa to get the green card. They can process immediately. So that applies in our situation. A U.S. citizen's spouse and minor children are immediate relatives, and they do not have to wait in line, which means once their petition is approved, they can immediately go to process the visa. However, there's still the processing time. Okay, so now the first place to start is to introduce the process, the general process to get a green card for your family member. Now, we're talking about normal process through USCIS, filing it in the U.S. So normally there are 3 steps involved to get a green card for your foreign spouse or your children. The first step is to file a petition called an I-130. That's the name of the form. And you file the petition normally in the U.S. at a certain location, Dropbox location, with USCIS. That will take several months to process, as we'll talk about later. It's a long processing time. But once it's approved, once the petition is approved, USCIS will forward your case to an office called the National Visa Center. We call it NVC. And they process the filing fees and the DS-260, the application for the visa, the online application the family member is going to file for the visa, and to make sure that all the documents are submitted to be able to schedule the interview for the family. And then finally, the spouse and children will appear for an immigrant visa interview at the U.S. Embassy or Consulate in their home country. Now, under normal circumstances, the process for securing green cards for immediate relatives is very lengthy. It takes a long time. And therefore, there's a long delay in being able to relocate and move to the U.S. However, there are some very limited circumstances where the green card petition can be filed directly at their U.S. Embassy or Consulate abroad, meaning in their home country, rather than filing it in the U.S. And as we're going to discuss today, that has several very, very important, significant advantages. Okay, so let's talk about what are those circumstances which would allow for direct filing at the local U.S. Embassy or Consulate. You'll see here a list. We're not going to go through most of them. It's really the last one that we're going to talk about today. You'll see here military emergencies, medical emergencies, threats to personal safety, a child who's close to aging out, which means, as we talked before, there are immediate relatives and non immediate relatives. So once a child reaches 21, they're no longer going to be able, or once they become an adult, they will no longer able to be immediate relatives and they'll have to wait in line. So that might be a reason for a direct filing. Petitioner was recently nationalized, the same thing. They were originally a green card holder, now they're a U.S. citizen. That will change the timing. Adoption. But then what we're going to talk about today on the bottom here, a short notice for position relocation. Basically, the U.S. citizen has a job offer in the U.S. They're being reassigned there, and they need to be able to complete the process in time to get them and their family to the U.S. for the start date of the job. Okay, so now let's talk about why this is so important. What are the advantages of a direct filing? The first and most important advantage is you avoid lengthy USCIS and NVC processing times. Your total processing time will be shortened from a total of about 12 to 16 months to often under 5 months. Secondly, the I-130 petition is filed in person at the U.S. Consulate or embassy. That is very important. Why is it important? Because if you think about, if you file it in the U.S. and they have questions or there's something missing or something wrong, you're not going to get that response for sometimes 9+ months. And then you'll have to correct it. Whereas here, you file it in person, and if there's something that needs to be corrected, it can be corrected on the spot, and it will also hopefully be approved on the spot, which saves many, many months in processing time. Also, there are certain financial obligations which the U.S. citizen is going to have to show to be able to get the green card for their family. And having the job offer is going to help a lot. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later. Also, the U.S. citizen and his family, or his or her family, are going to have to show that they have the intention to move to the U.S. That's one of the requirements to get the green card. Obviously, for the U.S. citizen to have a job offer in the U.S. is crucial in showing the domicile, they intend to domicile in the U.S. if they have the job offer there. There are also certain filing fees of MVC review, reviewing documents that you save by going on the direct route. Okay, so now we're going to give an overview of the process from A to Z. So the first step is to actually make the request. So you make a request of your local U.S. Embassy or Consulate to allow you to file the I-130 petition directly with the U.S. Embassy or Consulate. That request, depending on the embassy or consulate, will either be made by email or in writing, but usually it's a pretty quick process for them to confer with USCIS and hopefully approve you filing it directly, which will then expedite the process. Now, once they approve and allow you to direct file, they'll actually have to file the petition. The U.S. citizen will get an appointment, they'll go in, they'll file the full petition with all the supporting documents, and hopefully it will get approved right there and then. The third step of the process is for a case number gets assigned, and now you basically have an approved petition, and you're ready to work towards getting the interview. Each family member will need to complete an online visa application called the DS-260. That's done online, and then once that's completed, they could schedule their interview. Now, this is very important because if you're filing in the U.S., you have to wait for NVC to collect fees and to review documents, and only then will they schedule the interview. So again, you'll save often many months on the total processing time by the fact that you control the process in scheduling the interview. It's also at that time that you register for courier service, so you make sure that once the visa is issued, it gets sent back to you. And then, of course, the spouse and children will appear for their interview at the U.S. Consulate or Embassy, and hopefully the visas will be approved. They'll wait for visa processing, and hopefully within a few weeks, the passports will be returned with immigrant visas ready to go to the U.S. Now, let's talk about some of these steps individually because they're pretty important. So as I said, we're talking about getting a direct approval for direct filing based on a job offer. So when you make the request for direct filing, you're going to need to show details about what the job offer is. We always recommend having a letter from the U.S. employer as well as the actual offer letter agreement, and it should state a description of the employer, who they are, what they do, the job offer, what the position is, description of what they're going to be doing in the U.S., what the U.S. citizens' job is going to be, what their salary is, and of course the intended start date, which is the reason for the need for direct filing. We can also talk about why their experience is relevant and why they're needed in the U.S. and that the failure of them to be able to take this job could cause financial loss for both the U.S. citizen and possibly the employer. Okay, now let's hope your expedited request is approved and you're ready to file the petition at your U.S. Embassy or Consulate. So you need to prepare the I-130 petition, and let's talk a little bit about what's involved in the I-130. So the U.S. citizen will need to file a petition, a separate petition for each member of the family. That means separate petition for a spouse and each child that they're applying for a visa for. And they'll also have to include supporting documentation, which is generally going to establish the family relationship, which makes their family eligible for the visa. So we're talking about birth certificates and marriage certificates. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. There's a separate form called the I-130A, which is completed only by your spouse, only needed for a spouse. And you'll also need to establish the documentation that the marriage is bona fide, which means that USCIS, or in this case, the embassy or consulate, needs to be satisfied that you didn't get married just to get your spouse a green card. Basically, they watch too many movies. The longer you're married, the less external evidence you're going to need to show that your marriage is bona fide. It's important to know that all foreign language documents will need to include a certified translation, and also just note the filing fee, which is $535 for each application. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the supporting documents that will be sent or filed with the I-130 petitions, which establish eligibility. So, first thing, you're going to need to prove that you're a U.S. citizen, U.S. passport, certificate of naturalization, report of birth abroad if you were born outside the U.S. All those are evidence of that you're a U.S. citizen. Obviously, for the spouse, you're going to need a marriage certificate. It has to be valid in the country where you got married. As we spoke about before, you're going to need evidence of a bona fide marriage, things like joint bank accounts, joint residence, birth certificates for your kids. You may want to include family photos, wedding photos, proof of trips you took together. Again, if you're married a long time, if you have kids, you don't need so much other evidence like the photos. If you're only married though a few weeks or a few months, you might want to have affidavits from people who know you and can attest to your relationship and the length of your relationship and the commitment. And this is also where it's really helpful that you're filing in person, because here the officer sees you, speaks to you, and they get a good sense that the marriage is bona fide. Also, because you have the whole process stems from the job relocation, from the job offer, obviously the chances that the officer will question the bona fide of the marriage is obviously less. Birth certificates to show for children especially, Any name changes, you need evidence of the certificates showing the name change, copies of all passports, and you'll need passport photos. Okay. Now, before we get to the pre-interview checklist, let's just review a little bit about how we get to the interview. As we spoke about the steps before, we have the filing of the I-130 petition, which hopefully gets approved at the U.S. Consulate or Embassy. Then we have the filing of the online visa applications, the DS-260, and then you can schedule the interview and and sign up for the courier delivery. But you could schedule the interview, but you also want to make sure that you're going to be ready for the interview. So we're going to talk about the documents, the additional documents that you're going to need and what you need to show at the interview yourself, at the interview that the spouse and children are going to need to attend. So we spoke about the registration for courier service, which is important. Each family member will need to attend a medical exam. Generally, there are limited doctors that are approved for this. You can't just go to your own doctor. And you're going to need to bring the family members are going to need to bring all the original documents that were included in the I-130 petition, the birth, the marriage, any divorce certificates, death certificates from previous marriages, change of name certificates. The I-864 affidavit of support. We're going to talk more about this in one of the next slides. But basically, the U.S. citizen needs to meet a certain financial threshold and show that they can support their family based on the size of their household. And that's the form where they demonstrate that. And they'll need to also have supporting financial documentation showing their income and their tax returns. If there's a military service, the family member will need to show that they completed their military service. Each adult family member will need a police certificate. You need a police certificate from every country where you're either a national of or you've lived over the age of 16 for more than 6 months. If there's any criminal background, you'll need court or prison records. And the visa application fee is $325. And again, you're going to need passport photos for each family member so that the visas can be processed. Okay, so now let's get into the I-864 because it's probably the most difficult for most of our clients to understand, to fill out. And it's usually most of the time, especially when we're dealing with an expedited direct filing where there's a job offer, this is usually where the hang-up could be. What do we have here? So the form will have, obviously, information about the immigrant, which in this case is usually the spouse, information about the sponsor, obviously the U.S. citizen is the sponsor, and their household size. And then you're going to need to show what the sponsor, what the U.S. citizen's employment and income, because that employment and income is going to be compared to the federal poverty guidelines based on the size of the household, and it will need to be at least 125% of that to support the immigration. You'll need federal tax returns for the past 3 years, the information, and you need to attach the family member the spouse should bring a copy of the most recent tax return to the interview. You may need to include assets. If the income is not high enough to reach the threshold, then you could detail them in the form. And finally, the form is not just an affidavit, but it's a contract between the U.S. citizen sponsor and the U.S. government, basically stating that if the family member who they're sponsoring will ever need government assistance, the U.S. government can come after the sponsor, the U.S. citizen, to recoup the money. And that's the main goal of the financial affidavit. Now, children under 18 do not need the I-864 because they're going to become citizens on entry to the U.S. There's a separate form, a waiver form called I-864W that is done to the children. Okay, so now we've gotten to the interview. the spouse and children, all ages, will need to go to the U.S. Embassy or Consulate for an interview. They will need to establish several things. Obviously, eligibility shouldn't be an issue because the petition is already approved, but it can come up again. They can question any basis from the petition. But usually, there are two main things that are issues at the interview itself. One is the financial affidavit that we spoke about. The embassy wants to make sure that the spouse can support the family that they're sponsoring. If they can't, if the income is not high enough, they'll need to get a joint sponsor, someone else in the U.S., a U.S. citizen who lives in the U.S. and can show by their tax return that they have enough income and are willing to sponsor the family member. You could also use your assets and your spouse's income to make up the threshold. But that's one issue. The second thing is the domicile. You'll need to show that your intention is to move to the U.S. And as we spoke about before, having the U.S. job offer goes a long way towards satisfying this. Other things that you could show is having a bank account in the U.S., an address, a place to live already. Maybe you've already arranged schools for your kids. All those will show that you are serious about moving to the U.S., which is necessary to be able to get the green cards. So hopefully all goes well, and in really a few months' time, your family can get their green cards, the visas for their green cards, with their passports back from the embassy. Usually it takes several weeks. Every embassy has different processing time. And they'll get their passports returned with a visa and a welcome instruction sheet. And they'll basically take that when they go to the U.S. to the border, and they'll present it. When they enter the U.S., they'll get a stamp in their passport, and that stamp serves as an effective permanent resident card, a green card, until they actually get the permanent resident card in the mail. And the permanent resident card, you see an example here on the slide, basically as proof that they can live and work and travel to and from the U.S. But of course, you have to maintain your status by maintaining domicile, by living in the U.S. And that's basically the procedure. Important also to note, obviously we've given an overview. There are other issues that can obviously play into this. Things like if there's a criminal history, or maybe the family member, when they were a child, already had a green card, they never returned it. They'll need to make sure that they return it. You can't get a green card, even if you have one, even if it's no longer valid. Maybe if someone had a bar to getting a visa, that's going to need to be addressed. All those things will need to be taken into consideration. But in the usual case, when those things are not present, the process is pretty straightforward. And the best part about the expedited direct filing is the processing time is just so much faster. And again, by having the in-person filing of the petition and then the interview and having control over the process really just gives a lot more security, and just in general makes the process run a lot more smoothly for most people. Okay, so that concludes the webinar. Please feel free to get in touch with us with any questions. We're always here and happy to help and to assess any situation. And hopefully all your plans are fulfilled, and everyone is being able to get what they need done in time, in the best possible time and the most efficient way. So thank you for listening, for joining us. And again, feel free to contact us with any follow-up questions.